My son said it straight to my face. "Dad, you don't belong there. Just stay home and clean up." I stood still, holding my old suit jacket. The house went quiet, like it was closing in on me. They were getting ready to fly to Monaco. I was handed a list of repairs, like I was the gardener. The irony was this: the money for that trip wasn't even theirs. The next morning I opened my laptop. I saw my name on the legal documents, and in that moment I decided to shut the door on the trust I had carried for so many years. If you're listening to this story right now, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I'll keep telling it, slowly, honestly, starting from the moment everything began to change. I folded the suit jacket and laid it over the back of the chair, not because I was obeying, but because I understood something then. I had just been pushed out of a world I helped build with my own hands. The house in suburban Connecticut felt quieter than usual. The wall clock kept ticking, steady and calm, as if reminding me that time takes no one's side, not even those who once believed family was the safest place to stand. Julian had been busy all week before the trip. His phone never stopped buzzing. Short calls, quick nods, his eyes always looking past me, like I was just an obstacle in the frame. Chloe showed up less and less. When she did come home, she passed by with a thin smile, polite enough to avoid blame, cold enough to make it clear. I wasn't part of their story. I didn't ask much. At my age, I've learned that what you're not invited into, you don't force your way through. Still, I hoped that when they talked about their wedding anniversary, they'd remember the man who built the kitchen where they shared their first dinner. I hoped that when they mentioned the trip, they'd ask if I wanted to come along, even if it was just out of courtesy. Instead, I got a list. It was taped to the fridge right below an old photo of me and Julian when he was little. Fix the back fence. Replace the shed light bulb. Clean the front yard before the new neighbors move in. No explanation. No thank you. Just one last note written in Chloe's blue ink. "Dad, please stay home and help us. Don't go out much." I read each line slowly, not because the writing was small, but because every line weighed more than I expected. I've built houses for others. I've repaired things people forgot about. But this was the first time I saw myself placed exactly where I fit, as something useful. Used when needed, put away when not. The evening before they left, Julian walked into the living room. He stood across from me. He didn't sit down. That alone said more than words ever could. "Don't be upset, Dad," he said, low and fast. "Not everyone fits in places like that." I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to turn that moment into a pointless argument. I looked at his new shoes. Polished, clean, never touched the dirt in the backyard. I remembered his old shoes, back when I taught him how to build his first chair. He used to brag to his friends that his dad was the best carpenter on the block. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, not to see them off, but to finish the list. I replaced the light bulb, fixed the fence, trimmed the bushes. The work was familiar. My calloused hands moved with the same precision as always. But in my mind, something was shifting, slowly and beyond repair. By noon, I went into the small office in the corner of the house. Hardly anyone ever went in there. Old papers, old bills, and a computer I rarely used. I turned it on without any clear reason, just a habit, checking things before closing them for good. My name appeared on the screen, not in a letter, but in the family account records. I frowned. I remembered handing management over to Julian long ago. I trusted him with numbers more than myself. I believed my son would never let money become my worry. I scrolled through the transactions. The amounts weren't shocking, but the way they showed up was flight payments, luxury accommodations, everything bundled neatly, clean, calculated, like it had all been planned carefully, except for one detail I never planned for, the source of the money. It was the fund I'd set aside for my final years, for medical care, for the days when I wouldn't be strong enough to work anymore. I sat there for a long time, not angry, not shaking, just an emptiness opening in my chest, right where trust used to live. That's when the irony became clear. I was considered unfit for their high-end world, yet my sweat was paying for dinners I wasn't invited to. I was told to stay home and clean, yet the legal signature was still mine. That afternoon, I locked the tool shed. Sunlight leaned across the freshly trimmed garden. I stood there, looking at my work, and realized this might be the last time I did these things, as someone still waiting. There was no one to confront then. Julian was on his way to the airport. Chloe was probably double-checking luggage. His in-laws, the ones who always looked at me with polite distance, were surely expecting a perfect trip. And me, I stood in the old house with a finished checklist and a truth laid bare. I said nothing. I made no calls. I sat down at the desk, opened the computer again, and began reading every line of fine print I had once ignored. It wasn't a moment of revenge. It was the moment I understood this simple truth. If I didn't protect myself, no one else would do it for me. And once a door of trust closes, what comes next isn't anger. It's a decision, one that must be prepared very quietly. I didn't shut the computer right away. I left the screen glowing, as if to remind myself those numbers were real, not a trick of age or tired eyes. Outside, I heard a neighbor's car pull away, then fade into the distance. The house slipped back into its familiar silence. I breathed slowly, evenly, the way I used to when measuring a piece of fine wood. No rushing. One small mistake can throw everything off forever. I read through the legal documents again. My name was still there, clear, undeniable. I remembered the day I signed them. I told Julian I trusted him to handle the things I no longer had the strength to watch closely. That trust didn't disappear overnight, but it had cracked deep enough for me to understand one thing: from now on, every decision had to be mine. I made a cup of tea and carried it into the office. My hands didn't shake. I didn't call my son. I didn't send a message. I knew if I did, the conversation would slide into emotions, and emotions wouldn't help me now. What I needed was clarity. I logged into the bank account. The system asked for verification. I followed each step slowly. I haven't used much technology these past years, but I've never been afraid to learn. Carpentry taught me this. If you don't understand a tool, it will hurt you. My granddaughter had shown me the steps before. I'd written everything down carefully. The transaction list appeared in full. I checked dates, compared amounts. There was no room for misunderstanding. Premium airline tickets, extended luxury accommodations, everything arranged neatly, as if the person spending the money was certain no one would ever look too closely. I glanced at the clock. They were on their way to the airport. Time was short, but it wasn't gone yet. I didn't feel anger the way people usually describe it. What I felt was a strange calm. When something is laid bare so clearly, there's nothing left to argue about. I thought about what Julian said days earlier. "Dad, you don't fit in places like that." Maybe he was right in one sense. I don't fit into standing on the sidelines watching others decide for me. I selected the option to cancel services. The system asked me to confirm. I read every line. No hesitation. I clicked confirm. A brief message appeared. Dry. Final. I moved on to the next charge. Then the next. Not fast. Not slow. Each confirmation felt like closing a door I'd left open for far too long. After that, I looked at the remaining balance. I didn't withdraw it all at once. I paused, thought it through. Not out of fear, but because I needed a plan. I transferred the money into a separate account under my name alone, quietly, without drawing attention, just putting things back where they belonged. The afternoon passed in silence. I cleaned the office, sorted through old papers. There were things I'd kept for decades, my first contract receipts for lumber photos of finished jobs. It struck me then. I'd spent my whole life building for others. Only now was I learning to rebuild boundaries for myself. My phone buzzed. A missed call. I didn't need to look to know who it was. I turned the phone face down on the table. Not to avoid anyone, but to keep my resolve steady. I told myself this: if things had to be said, they would be said when I was ready, not when I was cornered. That evening, I ate alone. A simple meal. I didn't turn on the television. I listened to the wind on the porch, the trees brushing against each other. I thought about Monaco. About places people call high-end. I had no clear picture of it, only the knowledge that I was considered unfit for that world. That thought no longer made me feel small. It simply showed me exactly where I was standing. Before bed, I opened the computer again. I reviewed their itinerary, the reservations that had once been set. I no longer felt like I was interfering in my son's life. I felt like I was correcting a misalignment. Like a door hung crooked on its hinges, you have to take it down and fix it, even if it takes time. That night, I slept deeper than I expected. No dreams, no restlessness, just the sleep of a man who had made a decision and accepted its weight. The next morning, I woke early. Sunlight streamed through the window, highlighting scratches on the wooden floor I'd built with my own hands. I made coffee, sat down, opened my email. Confirmation notices appeared, short, clear. I read each one, then saved them. Not as evidence, not yet, but as a reminder that things had changed. I was no longer the man who stayed home cleaning while others spent my money. And I wasn't waiting for an apology. I stood up and pulled an old suitcase down from the attic. It had traveled with me on work trips long ago. I opened it, packed a few clothes, a few personal items. Not much. I didn't know exactly where I would go first, but I knew this: I wouldn't stay to watch over a house where I was no longer respected. As I zipped the suitcase shut, I paused for a moment. Not out of regret, but because I understood that from this point on, every step would lead me toward a confrontation I'd never imagined. I didn't call it revenge. I called it a choice. And choices made in silence often lead to meetings no one can prepare for. I didn't fly straight through. At my age, I have no interest in racing someone else's schedule. I stopped in Italy first, to see an old friend I met back when I used to take jobs far from home. He's a tailor. We didn't talk much about the past. We didn't need to. Just watching the way he measured my shoulders, adjusted the collar. I knew I was being treated like a man again, not a shadow placed behind others. The suit was finished faster than I expected. Simple, no show. It fit. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see myself younger. I saw myself clearer. I wasn't wearing it to prove anything. I wore it because I respected myself. When I arrived in Monaco, the city didn't greet me with grand words. It opened with light, with clean stone steps, with wide lobbies where people pass one another without looking. I walked slowly, no rush. I carried a small bag and the address of a hotel already confirmed. Not the most expensive one, just the right place. I checked in, went to my room, set the bag down. From the balcony I could see a slice of the sea. So calm it was almost indifferent. I stood there for a long while, not thinking about Julian, not thinking about Chloe. I let my breathing settle into the distant sound of waves the same way I used to after finishing a difficult build. That afternoon, I went out. I walked the streets where shop windows glowed, where cars stopped exactly where they should, where everything moved like a well-maintained machine. I didn't shop. I just observed. In places like this, people size each other up quickly. By shoes, by watches, by the way they stand. I didn't try to change that. I just stood where I belonged. I saw them before they saw me. Julian was across the street near a fast food stand. He wasn't eating, just waiting. Chloe stood beside him. Her face couldn't quite hold its usual calm. His in-laws stood a little apart, each keeping distance, as if they didn't want to be seen together in that moment. I didn't need to hear a word. The way they stood said enough. I didn't walk over. I didn't call out. I stood on the balcony of a hotel across the street where I'd stepped in for a glass of wine. I raised the glass, not to celebrate, but to keep my hands occupied. My eyes met Julian's. He looked up. We stared at each other. No words. No gestures. Just a silence that lasted longer than usual. I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen when he faced business partners or his wife's family. Confusion. I didn't smile. I didn't turn away right away either. I held his gaze long enough for him to understand one thing I knew. Then I went back inside. That night I ate dinner alone. The restaurant was quiet. I chose a corner table where I could look out without being noticed. I ate slowly. Not because the food was special, but because I didn't want emotion pulling me forward too fast. I thought about the house in Connecticut, about the list taped to the fridge. I thought about how everything had led me here. Not with one sudden leap, but with small steps ignored, one by one. My phone buzzed. This time I looked. A short message. No apology. No explanation. Just a request to meet. I set the phone down and kept eating. I didn't reply right away. Not to punish anyone, but because I needed to be sure that if the meeting happened, it would happen on my terms. The next morning, I woke early. I walked along the harbor. Yachts sat anchored there, silent and polished. I thought about the small wooden boats I used to repair for people by the lake. No one took photos of them, but they stayed afloat because they were built right. That thought made me feel lighter. I returned to the hotel and changed clothes. Not to impress, but so I wouldn't walk into a confrontation wearing the clothes of someone who had been pushed aside. I sat down and wrote a few notes. Not long, just points to remember, facts that needed to be said, without extra emotion. By midday, another message came in. A location was suggested, a high-end restaurant. I agreed. Not because it was expensive, but because places like that tend to keep voices low, and truth when spoken there has a way of carrying far. Before leaving the room, I stopped in front of the mirror. I looked at the man standing there. Not a gentleman learning manners late in life. Not a bitter old man. Just someone who had decided not to stay silent anymore. When I stepped out of the hotel, sunlight fell straight onto the road ahead. I knew I was heading toward an informal meeting, but the consequences wouldn't end with a meal. I carried no anger. I carried neatly folded documents inside my jacket, and I understood this sometimes silence held just long enough can expose more than any accusation ever could. The restaurant sat on a quiet street far from the noisy paths of tourists. When I walked in, everything was already arranged. A long table, white linens, soft lighting. The Whitmore family sat on one side. Julian and Chloe sat across from them. No one stood to greet me. I didn't mind. I chose my chair, sat down, and placed my hands on the table. There was no need to speak right away. The first minutes passed in an awkward politeness. A few formal phrases drifted out, thin, brief. I listened. I didn't interrupt. In places like this, people are used to talking about achievements, connections, things that can be measured. I let them speak, let my breathing slow, steady. When the first course was served, Julian looked at me. His eyes no longer held confidence. He opened his mouth as if to explain. I raised my hand very slightly. Not to command, just to signal that I would speak when the time came. I took the folder from the inside pocket of my jacket and placed it on the table. I didn't toss it. I didn't slide it. I set it down neatly. "These are what I found," I said, my voice low, just loud enough for everyone at the table. Not assumptions, documents. No one touched their cutlery after that. Chloe stared at the tablecloth. The Whitmores fell silent, their eyes shifting from me to Julian. I opened the folder and turned the pages. I didn't read every detail out loud. I pointed out what mattered: dates, charges, account names, things that don't need interpretation. Julian tried to speak. I looked at him, not harshly, but enough to make him stop. I wasn't here for an argument. I was here for the truth laid out in order without emotion. "I handed over management because I trusted you," I said. "I did not hand over permission to use my money for purposes that had nothing to do with me." No one argued. The silence thickened. This was no longer a meal. It became a reckoning, a moment where everyone had to see where they stood. Mr. Whitmore, the oldest man at the table, cleared his throat. He asked Julian a short question, not accusatory, but direct. Julian answered evasively. Then he fell quiet. That silence said more than his explanation ever could. Chloe looked up at me for the first time since I arrived. Her gaze had lost its sharp edge. I wasn't looking for sympathy. I looked at her the way I would look at a surface before deciding how to fix it. "I didn't come here to embarrass anyone," I said. "I came to put things back where they belong." The Whitmores exchanged looks. I saw confusion there, and disappointment. Reputation was something they valued above all else. This truth was inconvenient, but it was still the truth. I didn't need to say more for them to understand. Julian half stood, then sat back down. I looked at him, and this time I allowed myself one longer sentence. "You were afraid I'd embarrass you in front of others," I said. "But what embarrasses people isn't where they come from. It's how they use trust." No one interrupted. I saw Julian's hand tighten, then release. He looked down. I didn't feel victory in that moment. I felt a necessary ending. I closed the folder. I didn't demand an answer. I didn't ask for an apology. I simply made the next thing clear. From today on, I said, anything related to my finances will be decided by me. Everything else, you'll handle on your own. The Whitmores nodded. Not all at once, but clearly enough. No one asked questions. They knew that any questions now would only make things worse. Chloe placed her hand over Julian's, then pulled it away, a small gesture. But I saw the distance forming. I stood first. I didn't wait for dessert. I didn't look back at the table. As I turned away, I heard a chair shift slightly, then stop. No one called me back. Outside, the air was cooler. I took a long breath. Not relief, but clarity. I knew I had just placed a period not on a relationship, but on a way of living that had gone on too long. I walked for a while without direction. Street lights reflected off the stone pavement. I thought about the years I stayed quiet to keep the peace. I understood then that silence had been mistaken for consent. My phone vibrated. A message from Julian. I didn't open it. Not out of anger, but because I knew some words spoken now would only blur what had just been made clear. I returned to the hotel, went up to my room, set the key down. I hung up my jacket, folded the papers, and placed them in the drawer. I sat in the chair and looked out from the balcony. The city moved on as if nothing had happened, and I realized that was a good thing. The confrontation was over. Judgment didn't need a raised voice. It lived in who was still trusted and who had to relearn how to stand on their own. I knew I wouldn't return to that table. And I knew that, from this moment forward, the road ahead would leave no room for the old compromises. I left Monaco on a quiet morning. No farewells, no urgent calls. I rolled my suitcase through the lobby, returned the key, and stepped outside. The early light rested gently on the pavement. Soft, even. I realized I wasn't carrying any sense of winning or losing, only the relief of a man who had put his boundaries back where they belonged. I didn't return to Connecticut right away. I needed time for things to settle, including inside myself. I passed through a few coastal towns, staying where no one knew my name. I woke early. I walked. I ate simple meals. In small cafes, no one asked what I did for a living. They only asked what I wanted to drink. That simplicity took me back to my early years as a tradesman, when the value of a day was measured by doing one thing properly. During those days, I finished what needed to be done. The house in Connecticut had always been in my name. I contacted an agent. No rush, no pressure on the price. When the paperwork was ready, I signed, slowly. Each stroke of the pen felt like the final joint connecting me to an old chapter. I didn't feel loss. I felt like I was trimming my life down to the size it truly needed to be. I set aside part of the money for a local trade school fund, not for recognition, not to make an impression. I remembered the kids who used to stand by job site fences watching me work with quiet curiosity. I believe hands that know honest work can open more doors than people realize. The rest I kept for short trips, enough to remind myself the world is wider than an old kitchen. I didn't reach out to Julian. I didn't wait either. One afternoon, as I sat on a bench facing the sea, my phone vibrated. A short message. No explanations. It said he understood. I read it. I didn't reply right away. Not out of coldness, but because what needed to be understood had already been understood through action, not words. A few days later, I sent him a small package. No formal return address. Inside was the first woodworking tool set I'd given him when he was a boy. I'd kept it for years. I included a small note written steady and clear. Build your honor again with your own hands. No rush. I don't know when he'll read it. I don't need to know. That evening, I stood on the deck of a slow-moving ship, heading toward the horizon. The sun set quietly. Not dramatic. Just warm enough. I thought about what had passed. Not to blame, but to place things where they belonged. I once believed staying was responsibility. Now I understand. Leaving at the right time is also responsibility to oneself. I blocked Julian's and Chloe's numbers. There was no anger in that decision. It felt like closing a door so the wind wouldn't blow back into the house. If we ever speak again, it will be a new conversation not built on old compromises. Night fell. The ship moved smoothly. I listened to the steady water against the hull. I rested my hand on the rail, feeling a familiar solidity. I've spent my life working with wood with joints that must be precise. Life is the same. When a joint is done carelessly, it shows sooner or later. When you fix it the right way, there's no need to show it off. I don't call this story a perfect ending. Some distances remain. Some things take time. But I call it a good ending. Good because I chose self-respect. Good because the truth was placed on the table without raised voices. Good because I no longer live to fit someone else's gaze. When I stepped inside, the hallway lights came on. I hung up my jacket, set my hat down, and sat. I felt steady enough to continue. Light enough not to carry burdens that were never mine to begin with. The price of respect isn't in the clothes you wear or the places you go. It's in having the courage to leave when you're no longer valued, and the courage to begin again slowly with your own two hands. If this story made you pause and reflect, please tap like to support it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, and share it with someone who might need a quiet reminder. Thank you for staying until the end. Your listening is the most meaningful thing of all.